Did you want to know more about this feature and how to use it? Or maybe your camera does not have this feature and you're wondering how you would use it if you had it on your camera. Well, keep watching. So welcome to another video. My name is Mario. So if you're new here, please consider subscribing for all things camera, photography, gear review, and all of that fun stuff. And if you're already subscribed and you came back, thank you again so much for being here.
Thank you so much for being here today.
So the Sony A7RV has a feature that not many people were talking about at the time that it was released. And this is a feature that has been longed for in many Sony cameras. I've been longing for this feature on the Sony A7 IV, which doesn't have it. Even the Sony A1, Sony's flagship camera, does not have it, at least not yet. So this is the built-in focus bracketing or built-in focus stacking. So it's great that Sony finally decided to include this on the Sony A7RV. To me, I feel that they could easily include it via firmware update to some of the other cameras like the A9, the A1, or even the A7 IV. But for some reason, they're not doing that, at least not yet. But I digress.
Stop complaining!
And I'm actually not 100% sure if there are any other Sony cameras that have this feature, and if you do happen to know about that, let me know in the comments below. So although this feature of focus bracketing is done in camera, it is not a complete automatic feature, because you still have to bring in all the photos that you take with your camera into post-processing, either in Photoshop or a software like Helicon Focus. But the great thing about this feature is that you can set your camera to automatically take photos at different focus points so that you can then bring these photos into your software, and in post you can come up with a fully sharp image throughout the foreground and the background. And it's great that you can do this in camera automatically as opposed to having to manually adjust your focus, which isn't as accurate. Another alternative is to use a focusing rail, but again, that requires another piece of equipment and a little bit more work. So let's talk about why you would need this feature. So sometimes when you're taking a photo, you want everything in sharp focus. For example, if you're doing a photo of landscape or architecture, or even if you're taking photos of products. But it's really hard to get everything in the foreground and in the background equally as sharp. You could stop down your aperture or close it down to f/18 or f/22. But the problem is that there can be a slight loss in resolution after f/8 due to diffraction in most high-resolution cameras. And if you have no idea what that is, I'll leave an article in the description below so you can familiarize yourself with what that is. The other thing too is that lenses have a sweet spot.
This is the sweet spot.
Not meaning that there's a part of the lens that tastes sweet, but in terms of the photos that they take, they have an aperture that they are most sharp at, or sweetest at. So anyway, so a lens sweet spot is the aperture at which it's the sharpest. And as a general rule of thumb, the sweet spot in your lens is about 2 to 3 stops down from your maximum aperture. So if your lens has a maximum aperture of f2.8, for example, the sweet spot will be probably about f8 or f11. And if you wanted to find out the sweet spot in your lens, I'm sure you can find that information online. Another issue with having everything in focus is when it comes to macro photography. Even when you're stopped down all the way to f/22, because of the way macro photography is, you still get a very shallow depth of field. And if you wanted your entire product or most of the subject that you're photographing to be entirely sharp and in focus, you really have to do focus stacking or use a focusing rail. As you can see right now, I'm all the way stopped down to f8. And there's still a lot of parts that are out of focus. At f11, same thing. Even close down all the way to f/22, I still get a lot of elements that are out of focus. And the subject is not fully sharp in the entire plane. So once you have selected your subject, this is how you can use focus bracketing on your Sony A7RV. So first of all, we have to access the settings. So go into the menu on your camera, then make sure you're in the shooting mode and go to drive mode. Then you go to bracket settings and focus bracket settings. Under focus bracket order, I usually like to set it onto this one, which means that the camera will start by focusing first on the first image and then shifting the focus from the second and subsequent images toward the end or the far side. This just means that your camera will shoot by focusing on the first image and then shift the focus back and forth from the second and subsequent images. So I'll select this. Exposure smoothing. It sets whether or not to automatically set the exposure value when shooting with focus bracket. I'll leave it as off. Shooting interval, I'll leave it at shortest for now. You can always adjust that later on. And under focus bracketing, save and destination, I would like to save them all in a brand new folder. So let's first set the exposure on this camera. I'll shoot at an aperture of f8.0 because this is close to that sweet spot of this lens. I'm using the Sigma 105 macro lens, the art one, and let's lower down that ISO. What we'll do is go to drive mode, and this is where you find focus bracketing. And here under bracket settings, you have the step width, which is the overlap between the shots. If you shoot at an aperture of f2.8 or something like that, then you pick a narrow one, like 1 for example. And if you shoot with a wide lens and stop down at an aperture of 8 or above, then you can shoot with a wide width, like a 10. If you're using a macro lens, then maybe standard or something lower than that. So I'll keep mine as standard. Under number of shots, you want to be a little bit more generous. The camera will stop taking the shots once it's done taking the shots from the closest focusing point all the way to infinity anyways. So it's just better to be generous. So I'll select the focus area and I'll set this part right here as my beginning focus area, and I'll start shooting. So now that we have all our photos taken, let's jump into our software and combine these photos. So I'll be using Photoshop, but there are other software out there that are able to do this job as well. One very popular one that specializes in focus stacking, merging is Helicon Focus. So if you know of another software that does this as well, let me know in the comments below. So if you look at the first photo, you can see that the focus is at the front, my first point of focus that I told the camera to take the photo at. And the last photo has the focus point all the way at the end. And in between, there are different photos that had different focus points in them. So I have all of these photos here in Lightroom. What I'm going to do now is right click on them and open them all as layers in Photoshop. This will send all of these photos to Photoshop. And once I'm in Photoshop, I can select all of these layers again, go to Edit, select Auto Align Images. And Photoshop is now going to automatically align all of your images. And depending on how many images you have to align, it may take Photoshop some time to do that. After Photoshop's done its thing, you go back into Edit, and this time click Auto Blend Layers. And select Stack Images, and make sure this checkbox is selected for tone. We'll let Photoshop do its thing.
That actually took a while.
And this is it. Photoshop has finished aligning and blending the focus on these images, and now you get an image that is sharp throughout the entire range. And once this is ready, you can click on Save, go back into Lightroom, and further do the rest of your color adjustments. This is how focus bracketing works, and I'm actually pretty glad that they finally decided to include this on the Sony A7RV. If you did not know about this, I hope that this video was useful to you and that you learned something new. If you haven't subscribed, make sure you hit the subscribe button. It will be greatly appreciated, and click the like button if you enjoyed this video or learned something new. And that'll be all for today, and I'll see you next time.